Now, the question of whether to pay ransom demands when terrorists abduct civilians has long been a controversial one. But a new report from the Royal United Services Institute here in London says the current situation where some governments pay and others don't is putting citizens right around the world at more risk. There have been several high-profile kidnappings in recent years. You might recognise behind me the American journalist James Foley. He was abducted in 2012 and killed nearly 2 years later. So-called Islamic State militants wanted several $1 million for his release. That same year, 26-year-old American aid worker Kayla Muller was abducted and later killed. Her parents were frustrated at the US government's policy of not paying ransoms to terrorists. Then in 2015, IS militants demanded a $200 million ransom for two Japanese hostages, Kenji Goto and Haruna Yukawa. Both men were killed. American journalist Austin Tice was also kidnapped whilst reporting in Syria in 2012. But his parents believe he is still alive. Well, with me is Tom Keating, the director of the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute. And thanks very much indeed for coming in today. Just tell us, why are you concerned about these different policies? Is that sending out basically conflicting signals?
So under international law, it is illegal to pay any money to terrorist groups. And I think everybody gets that. Where it gets complicated and where there is clearly no consensus around the world is where those payments are ransoms made to terrorist groups in order to bring back citizens. So some countries, like the United Kingdom and the United States, adhere strictly to the non-payment. Others, and you see their citizens coming home free and alive, many who were kept with James Foley, they do pay. And of course, that difference is something that terrorists are able to take advantage of.
I mean, you're dealing with people who are, irrational. If it was anyone in my family, I would want my government to pay. So it's very complicated.
Yeah, and there's plenty of polling where the citizens say we shouldn't pay ransoms. And then you ask them, well, would you pay a ransom if your loved one was taken hostage? And they say, yes, of course. So it's highly emotive. And some countries appear to favour the immediate return of citizens today over the long-term damage that paying ransoms does. And indeed, what we find, and there's plenty of examples of this, is that the money that is gathered, the many millions that are gathered by terrorist groups, are then recycled into further attacks. And clearly the current situation is suboptimal. The lack of consensus is of benefit to terrorists and definitely not of benefit to those that are kidnapped.
Just stay there for us a moment, Tom, because joining us now from New Hampshire is Diane Foley, the mother of James Foley. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm hoping that we can hear you. What is your view now? Your family have obviously been through the most unimaginable pain, I'm sure, but what is your view now about whether governments should pay these demands?
Well, first of all, I think this work that Tom and his colleague have done are excellent, because I think as Western nations, we must find ways to work together on this issue. Because I believe his conclusions are exactly right, that currently the US and UK hostages are suffering because we're trying to adhere to this ban and other nations are not. And it certainly is a very emotional issue. But I think we need to find a way to cooperate as nations so that we can stop the increased problem that this has become.
When you were going through your appalling ordeal, were you having conversations with the government about this question?
Well, yes. However, I was not as well informed. I found that our government's hands were tied in terms of negotiating in any way. They were not even allowed to interact with captors. And in that case, there's no hope for our citizens. I mean, someone needs to be able to interact if there's any hope of their return.
When you say that their hands were tied because they couldn't, I mean, what was stopping them from negotiating compared with, other countries who do?
Well, it was our country's decision to adhere to this ban on any type of concession. And that was understood to mean no ability to even interact. So our government was not even interacting. It was left to our family to interact with Jim's captors.
And how did you feel about that at the time? Did you try to make the government get more involved?
The government tried to be supportive, but it was obvious that their hands were off. They could not interact. They were not allowed to. And therefore, they would read our emails and give us advice, but would not take the lead in any way in helping us in that regard. They were not able to.
And just to ask a very difficult question, do you think if the government had paid money that your son would be with you?
You know, I don't think it's all about the money. I think a big part of it is about having skilled people engaging with captors to negotiate, to find out what they want and what they will accept. It's a very complicated issue. Certainly, ransom has been one of the ways to seek the return of hostages, but I think somebody has to be able to negotiate with people who capture our citizens, be it a private entity or our government. But in this case, it was left to us as a family, and we were unable to do anything in terms, they didn't want to talk to us.
Diane, thanks very much indeed for that. I just want to bring Tom back in. I mean, how are you proposing that you change the policy of the governments who say, no, look, if our citizens are in trouble, we're going to do everything we can to talk about individuals here to get them out?
Well, Diane makes a very important point, which is there are expert companies out there which have years and years of history in negotiating the return of kidnapped victims. But in the case of terrorist-related kidnappings, they are not allowed to act because they're not allowed to interact with designated terrorists. And so we should be taking advantage of that expertise. We have a ridiculous situation at the moment where governments are willing to pay whatever it takes to bring home their citizens, tens of millions of dollars, when actually these expert companies are expert at getting people home safely for considerably smaller sums. We shouldn't be funding terrorists, but if we're going to fund terrorists, then surely we should be paying them as little as possible via experts to bring home citizens who have been taken hostage.
And Diane, just if I can just ask you one further question. Are you in touch now with other families? Do other people come to you if they're in this awful situation? What advice do you have for them?
Well, the James Foley Foundation continues to advocate for the return of our citizens. However, I also feel there's a need for more research, such as this paper that Tom and his group have published, because we need to come to some consensus as Western countries. How do we bring our citizens home without funding terrorism? I think it's a very difficult issue, and it's a very important one as we increasingly become targets.
Diane Foley, I'm so grateful to you for your time. Thank you very much.